Hello, welcome to IMO with me, Aaron Bastani. You can follow me on Twitter at Aaron Bastani. You can follow Novara Media on Twitter at Novara Media. Like, share, comment on this content under the hashtag IMO Bastani. And you can, of course, subscribe to the Novara Media YouTube channel just below. Thanks for watching. So last week I talked about fully automated luxury communism and how it could perhaps inform a political horizon that helps us look at the future, but which builds upon observable realities in the present. And that's not to say, however, that I view fully automated luxury communism as inevitable, as historically determined, as necessarily going to happen. I'd say it has to have an attendant political project. It needs to be situated within understandings of the class struggle in order to come about, just like any political project and reality. And that's why this week I want to talk about two alternative futures that are essentially an extension of the present, that would be the continuation of capitalism by other means, because it's going to have to be by other means. It's going to have to change quite dramatically. The question is how, when, and why. And so the first one is space capitalism. Well, what's space capitalism? Well, if you look at the nature of this crisis since 2008, yeah, it's a big one. It is a big one, and it's going to require a new kind of capitalism that's equally big, right? But this is not the first time this has happened in the history of capitalism. You had similar crises in the 1870s, 1880s, and of course after 1929. And just as in 1929, it didn't really seem that there was a way out, right? You'd be there in 1929, the Wall Street crash happens, 1933, the rise of Nazism. It's not really till the early 1950s that you get a new model, a new capitalist model, right? Which creates jobs, growth, and it's highly profitable. Now, if we were to think of something similar to that coming at the end of this crisis, let's say that's 2, 3, 4 decades away, what would it be? I think space capitalism is the most compelling vision for that. Because it's clear that right now, commercial exploitation of space capitalism, which would essentially be hinged around things like, yes, space tourism and so on, but I think more so resource extraction beyond the Earth's environment. They're not ready to go just yet, but there are signs. There are signs that they could be commercially viable this decade, the next decade, the one after. So, what defines space capitalism? I've already talked about resource extraction. I'd say it's three things. The first one is things like resource extraction. To get things like precious metals, iron, nickel from comets and asteroids, that would require a huge outlay, huge amounts of investment and fixed capital to go and get this stuff, right? To bring it back, to distribute it. That's a huge amount of investment, and significant returns, right? It could be an incredibly profitable undertaking for investors. So that's one element of it. The second element is clearly if we were to have a continuation of a private property regime in space, just as we do on Earth, that would necessitate, of course, all of this being secured, right, guaranteed by a rule of law. If this was done by competing capitalist nation states, that would require military capabilities equally beyond the Earth's atmosphere, extraterrestrial, extraplanetary, military capability being projected in order to protect the interests of the United States or Russia or China or Nigeria or Iran in space as their capitalist class seeks to maximize its interests and take profits from things like resource extraction. So on the one hand, it means huge investments, huge returns. It also allows states to invest massively in military capabilities. Thirdly, it provides an exquisite opportunity to dump surplus population. Now, what's a surplus population? A surplus population is something that's as old as capitalism itself. It's people who are effectively of no use to capitalism. I'm not just talking about the criminal class or something like that. I'm talking about people who fundamentally cannot put themselves within the wage-labour relation, who can't find work, or who are underemployed, right? Who simply can't meet can't make ends meet under capitalism. Now, surplus populations, as Europe developed in the 19th century, as it urbanised, as it had this huge demographic growth, 5 of the top 10 countries by population in the 19th century were in Europe. Many of those people, that surplus population, migrated. They went elsewhere as Europe really upgraded to industrial capitalism. 60 million people emigrated from Europe between 1850 and 1930. 1815 and 1930, 60 million. So what happens as the whole world effectively goes through the same trends? Where do where does elements of the African surplus population go, or Asia? Where do they go? Because when it was just Europe, it meant colonisation and emigration to every single corner of the earth. Clearly that same process writ large for the world is a very difficult one to even comprehend. It would probably necessitate some kind of colonisation of other planets. If you've seen Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, maybe it might look something like that, right? You would have whole planetary colonies given over to colonizers, but these would effectively be people who colonize the planet on the basis that they can't actually live within a capitalist economy on planet Earth or elsewhere. Equally, it could be like Elysium. You can imagine other planets where the very wealthy, the very affluent, the well-to-do go and live, right? In a kind of planetary gated community. That might again seem kind of weird, bizarre, but all it is essentially a territorial delimitation of classes. That's something we already have. It's just by postcodes and streets rather than by planets. So that's space capitalism. It means big returns, big profits, and somewhere to dump your surplus population. These are three big problems for capitalism if it wants to, get back on top. The second one is green austerity. Now, green austerity is quite different to space capitalism as a solution to the crisis because it may sound nominally leftist and progressive. It would also attempt to deal with climate change, right? Space capitalism wouldn't. Space capitalism's solution to climate change would be saying, look, we can't all live on this planet. We've got to go elsewhere, right? And that would, in effect, include, like I say, elements of dumping surplus populations elsewhere. The solution of space capitalism to that is getting out, leaving the planet, right? Green austerity is different. It's saying we have to engage with the problem of climate change on Earth. We have to deal with it. It would again mean massive investment and returns, people investing in things like renewables. Where it's problematic, however, even though it may adopt some of the language of the left and of social justice, is that it would probably say, look, we have to make sacrifices. And those sacrifices would be twofold. Domestically, they'd be telling people like you and I in developed countries that we would have to move towards something like a war economy. It's a real big effort to meet the challenge of climate change. It's a war effort, essentially. And that's already been iterated by several people in the United States, including John Kerry. So that would be one element of submission and, sacrifice would be domestically. At the global level, they'd be saying to people in India, South Asia and Africa, they'd say, look, you can't develop, you can't have the same standards of living that people enjoy in Western Europe and North America. You simply can't, because if you do, the environment will no longer be able to survive. Yeah? So the environment will be privileged above the development, effectively, of the developing world. So it would be about submission. It would be about sacrifice, both within and across states. The problem with green austerity, however, is that while it accepts climate change is a problem, if you still had class system, if you still had capitalist nation states, you still had borders, it's difficult to see how it would deal with, clearly, the major flows of migration we're going to see as the climate transforms over the next 100 years. They may be willing to say, look, Fortress Europe needs to be further fortified, needs to be further defended, and that means excluding, Bangladesh, which is underwater, or Indonesia, which is underwater, or the Middle East, which is having huge resource crunches and massive political and military instability. That's what they may say. They may say that consolidation at the regional or the national level, national socialism 2.0 if you want, renewable national socialism, means that we also have to effectively exclude those who suffer the very worst excesses of climate change, who are frequently in the developing world. So that's green austerity. It says the environment is more important than social justice, and it would maintain and continue just nation states and the capitalist system. So those are the two alternatives to fully automated luxury communism. I don't think they're particularly hopeful. I think they're awful outcomes. I think they're dreadful possibilities. I'm only outlining them because I want people to know that fully automated luxury communism is not inevitable, but it requires a political project. In fact, given we live under the capitalist mode of production right now, the most probable outcomes of the crisis will be either green austerity, racialized, nationalized, still class-based, space capitalism, neoliberalism in space. Those are the two most likely outcomes of the crisis, unless there is an attendant political project. For me, that attendant political project attaches itself to the horizon, the vision of fully automated luxury communism. So that's all for this week. I really enjoyed the comments from last week's episode. They added a whole lot to the discussion. So similarly this week, if you've got something to add or even subtract from what I've said, you disagree, you agree, please put it in the comments below. I love to see what you have to say. Like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. This is IMO with Aaron Bastani. I'll see you same time, same place next week. Bye.